Now, for more on these latest developments, we have with us Dr. Koo Myung Hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. It's good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So the UN has adopted a resolution condemning North Korea's human rights record, and it's for the 14th year in a row, so it's hardly surprising that it's been adopted again. But what should we make of this news, especially considering the timing when negotiations are still ongoing over the regime's denuclearization?
Well, the international community's concern about the human rights situation in North Korea is not anything new. As you have pointed out, this is the 14th time the United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution condemning North Korea's record of systematic abuse of human rights against its own people. But then what's different this time is that the United Nations Security Council, which is composed of 10 temporary members of different member states and 5 permanent members, have decided not to pursue this matter at the Security Council level. This actually indicates that the United States and other member states of the United Nations are actually putting in political considerations into the human rights issue on North Korea. And the reason is because I believe there's been some progress in dialogue between North Korea and the South Korea and the United States this year. And I think that there's some movement in the international community to encourage North Korea to stay in this positive path. So maybe condemning North Korea at this point might not be the most productive move on the part of the international community. But on the other hand, the United Nations found back in 2014 through the publication of a landmark report on the human rights situation in North Korea called the Commission of Inquiry on the Human Rights Situation on DPRK, that North Korean state is engaged in systematic abuse against its own people. For example, the presence of political prison camps, and also as well as the restriction on the freedom of movement, and the fact that most people cannot engage in free market activities and other political forms of expression. It indicates that North Korea's human rights situation is in a dire state. So I think the international community had to balance two different issues, two different demands here. The political expediency of encouraging North Korea to stay engaged in dialogue with the rest of the world, but at the same time remind everybody, and North Korea especially, that North Korea cannot be accepted back into the international community as a normal state unless it addresses its horrendous human rights record.
I mean, this human rights record, we've known for a very long time how horrendous it is. But then the North Korean ambassador to the UN has offered some sort of reply. I mean, he said the allegations of human rights abuses were, in his words, the most despicable false words, and that was fabricated by a few defectors. Now, that in itself is also an incredible accusation to make against these defectors as well. I mean, how long can North Korea keep up this kind of stance, especially if it wants to kind of re-engage with the rest of the world?
Well, the reason why North Korea reacts so negatively towards this kind of accusations of human rights violations is it puts fundamentally at odds with its own self-perception of being a perfect state, believe it or not. We know from the North Korean propaganda that North Korean society actually is perfect. It's a workers' paradise, that everybody's human rights and social rights are totally guaranteed. And that's actually a very important ideological basis of the North Korean regime. So once you recognize that the North Korean regime is engaged in systematic and then grave abuse, human rights abuse against its own people, it undermines the legitimacy of its own regime. So I think North Korea hasn't had the chance to reconcile the reality on the ground, which is clearly very horrendous, with the fact that its ideological self-perception is very positive. So I think it'll take some time for North Korea to somehow come out with a viable compromise between the reality and how they view themselves.
Well, I guess they aren't the only oppressive regime that we've had in the UN councils before, anyway. But there is slight difference in the resolution this year, though, as well. It includes a section which welcomes the progress that has been made this year with the Inter-Korean summits and the summit with the US, especially pointing out the resumption of the family reunions that had been cancelled for a couple of years. It also notes the importance of dialogue in resolving these kinds of humanitarian issues. I mean, does this actually at least point to, as you say, some sort of recognition that perhaps North Korea, there is a way out for them?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, this is clearly a sign on the part of the United Nations and, by extension, the international community to recognize, acknowledge the fact that North Korea has made an effort to improve the human rights situation in the country, as well as allow the members of the separated families to get reunited, at least for few of them. And I think the international community would like to somehow keep encouraging North Korea to stay on this path. And then I think this is also an indication that if North Korea stays engaged in this good behavior, I think the international community would like to, probably, possibly would reward such good behavior with material, actions.
Mm. But it is still something that they will have to sort out and find some sort of resolution to these horrific human rights violations. But as we mentioned as well, there is this ongoing negotiation between the US and North Korea over the regime's denuclearization. This resolution, it doesn't change anything on that front, does it, though? Do you don't think the US or North Korea will be affected by this resolution coming back in, right?
Well, not in the short run. Clearly when it comes to what we have on our hands, which is North Korea's nuclear development, this resolution is not going to affect it too much. But we have to understand that North Korea's ultimate goal is not just to have a successful negotiation with the United States. Its ultimate goal is clearly to be accepted back into the international community as an upstanding member. And then that's going to be the difficult part if the international community doesn't acknowledge that North Korea is a country that respects human rights for its own people. So this is a big challenge for North Korea. Even if North Korea is successful in negotiating on successful negotiating on a positive outcome when it comes to North Korea's nuclear program, what's going to remain after that is the issue of a very sticking issue of the human rights records, and that's not an easy issue to address on the part of North Korea. So in the long run, I think even if we resolve the North Korean nuclear issue, I think the human rights issue is going to be something that impedes North Korea's further progress in the diplomatic front.
Meanwhile, there are inter-Korean exchanges on the Korean Peninsula happening while all this is happening as well. South Korea's defense ministry confirmed that 11 guard posts on either side of the border that they had agreed to destroy had been completely dismantled and they can't be used for military purposes again. But there are still some 200 or so reported guard posts along the border still. Of course, we don't know the exact number because it's still a secret on both sides. So is this move simply a symbolic gesture, or is this actually some significant step towards perhaps lowering military tensions?
Well, these kind of gestures, these kind of measures that both Koreas have undertaken are called the confidence building measures. And the reason why we call them confidence building measures is because there's no trust between the two parties. So even though these steps are actually pretty insignificant in the overall scheme of things, as you have pointed out, there are still, even though we destroyed 11 guard posts, there are still 200 or plus remaining on the DMZ. These are actually the first step towards building more confidence. This is just the first step, I believe. So if we're successful, if the two sides gain trust on each other, we'll be progressing into the next phase of confidence building measures that could conceivably involve more removal of additional guard posts. So eventually we'll get there, hopefully. If things progress the way you expect, and we hope that these things will progress in that way, we'll eventually reach a state where the two Koreas will be able to dismantle its aggressive offensive postures along the demilitarized zone.
This is not the only inter-Korean event that's been happening over the last couple of days. South Korean officials and inspectors also returned from their inspection of the North Korean railways, specifically the Eastern Donghae rail line. It's the first time that a South Korean train has traveled on those tracks. And this is all leading up to a groundbreaking ceremony that's set to take place next week on December 26th. But again, with sanctions in place, how can it really be a groundbreaking ceremony as it says it is? Won't it just be a ceremonial groundbreaking while the sanctions are in place and they can't really do anything more than that?
Oh, I definitely agree with what you just said. I think their emphasis will be on ceremony rather than on groundbreaking. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 2397 actually clearly forbids the member states from transferring to North Korea any sort of assistance in the areas of transportation and also like construction materials. So a groundbreaking ceremony that leads to immediate effort to reconnect the transportation network between the two Koreas would be in violation of the UN sanctions. So I don't think South Korea will go down that path. So, I mean, for now, the ceremony, the groundbreaking ceremony that's scheduled soon, it's going to remain as a ceremony rather than groundbreaking.
So then why are the either two sides actually going ahead with this then, if it's not going to lead to anything immediate? Are they trying to have some sort of tactic to pressure other parties here?
No, I think it's in order to keep the momentum of inter-Korean dialogue to move forward. If there's two, let's take the example of the US DPRK negotiations. There hasn't been much meeting, actually much noise regarding the talks in the last 3 months, and then the immediate perception in the world is that the negotiation has actually stalled, and it's actually giving place to a negative prognosis for the negotiation in the near future. So I think the South Korean government is trying to avoid same thing happening to the inter-Korean dialogue. So even though this is just a groundbreaking ceremony, which is more symbolic rather than actual, it's very important. It has an important role of keeping up the momentum and preserving the positive gain that we have achieved so far on the inter-Korean dialogue front this year. So I think even though it's symbolic, it's actually materially important.
Over this project to reconnect the railway, South Korea has perhaps had some trouble with the US about this project because obviously with the sanctions in place, there are all these very sensitive areas to go. But then it seems that the US has given its green light, but again this week a US delegation is coming to Seoul. Stephen Biegun, the US Special Representative of North Korea, will be coming with his team to discuss with South Korea in this working group that was set up last month as well. And it's the second meeting that they're holding, and they're going to be here for a few days to discuss it. So we're expecting them to discuss about this rail project, are we not?
Well, I think there's some higher level understanding between the South Korea and the United States when it comes to what South Korea intends to do with the railway project. I think Washington understands fully that, and also South Korea understands that this groundbreaking ceremony and this effort at creating this connection between the railways in the two Koreas is actually more of a special, exception to the general state of having strong sanctions against North Korea. So the United States didn't give a wholesale permission to South Korea to start the railway project with North Korea. It gave a waiver. So meaning this is just an exception to the rule. I think the reason why Steve Biegun is coming to Seoul is to not just to discuss about the South Korea's commitment to sanctions, but also to discuss about how to bring back the momentum to the negotiation, the nuclear negotiation with North Korea. There hasn't been much progress being made on that front in the last 3 months, and time is in a way like running out. If there's no progress being made on this front, then we don't know what's going to happen next year, and then we have to. North Korea hasn't really made clear what its position would be in terms of negotiations for the foreseeable future. So I think Steve Biegun will be here to discuss with South Korean counterparts about how to somehow elicit response from North Korea, as well as to continue negotiation with Pyongyang.
Biegun's meeting is set to go on till Saturday. He's going to be in Seoul. So we'll have to see what comes out by the end of the week.
Definitely.
Anyway, it's good to have you here as always, and thank you for giving us your insights.